Alright everybody, let me start out by saying I'm sorry these are getting posted significantly later than I would have expected or wanted. I did not get them completed due to, well, a series of things before I left St. Augustine for Indianapolis. And since I've been here, it's just been 2 days of absolute hell. So I'm just now getting them done. And again, I apologize for the timeline of that. I've broken it into 5 separate videos covering each chapter, so that way they'll be a little shorter for you to view and hopefully a little quicker for me to be able to upload onto the channel. The prezzies will be up online as PDFs, along with the link to being able to watch the screens, and you'll have it here on the video with kind of the step-by-step. Obviously the goal of these chapters, 4 through 8, was to look at the making of policy and walk us through the policy-making cycle. From agenda setting and formulation, looking at legitimizing decisions, looking at budgeting for them, looking at analyzing, implementation, all of the steps we talked about last week in terms of being in the general cycle. And a lot of it's information that you should have gotten in P80 301 in the A session. Hopefully if you're from Tuesday night and you're hearing a lot of this, it'll sound repetitive, especially when we get into the budgeting information, since you had me for it. But again, it's kind of framing the situation so that next week we can get in and start actually talking about policy issues in a meaningful way. With all of this as sort of background information to help guide us. Chapter 4, as you look at it, deals with agenda setting and policy formulation. So how issues rise to a level of national prominence. And then how we actually sit down and figure out how can we best, most suitably handle the issue of the day, of the issue at hand, without hopefully alienating too much of the mass public. Obviously, with agenda setting and any type of public policy, there has to be an issue. The problem must be deemed amenable to action. And again, it's amazing. First slide I show you, and there's a grammatical error after last week. That's a bad apostrophe S there. So when we look at a problem, we have to look at it and think, there's a way we can handle this. There's a way we can fix this. How do problems reach this point? People hear about them. People see about them. People see them around them. We hear news stories. If you think about issues like, sexting is a great example. 15 years ago, nobody would have ever thought about this. When did we start seeing sexting get mentioned in the public light? When we start seeing 12-year-olds getting let out of school in handcuffs and being labeled as sex offenders for the remainder of their lives because they chose to send an inappropriate selfie to a friend who then circulated it around a school. If we look at issues like education, poverty, natural disasters, gun control, we know when these issues arise. Education becomes a national topic every 3 or 4 years when the United Nations sends out another report looking at education across the world. Poverty becomes an issue every time the economic recession occurs, or an economic recession occurs. Natural disaster, every time we see a superstorm of some kind. Every time a tornado or an F5 touches down and wipes out a community, it becomes news. Gun control, every time there's a school shooting. And if you think about gun control, we've become almost immune to school shootings as agenda-setting items. We see school shootings now. If it's just one kid with a gun and 1 or 2 people get shot, it doesn't even break into CNN. It takes something unique, big numbers. And we also know that issues can be taken off of the public agenda. If we go back to the days of Prohibition, we go and write a constitutional amendment basically banning alcohol production. And then we come back 3 amendments later and we revoke it because we'd recognize that it wasn't the problem we thought it would be. Plus we recognized that the solutions we were offering weren't going to be effective. In 301, you should have talked about the issue attention cycle. This process where we first hear about something and it becomes major news very quickly. And everybody's talking about it and we want something done. And then at some point somebody shows up and says, okay, here's what it's going to cost. And once we hear that cost, all of a sudden we say, okay, that's not that big of a deal. Not for that price. Not for that price point at least. And then it dwindles and disappears until the same type of issue emerges in the future. We could also look at it as Baumgartner and Jones do, that we have this idea of punctuated equilibrium, where things ebb and flow, but every once in a while you hit a point where it's rich and there's a point of leverage that emerges that allows us to make some type of action we wouldn't be able to otherwise. Consider September 11th. Without September 11th happening, the idea that an individual would willingly say, I'll take off my belt, I'll take off my shoes, you can pat me down, you can do whatever you want, TSA, wouldn't have happened. But there was punctuated equilibrium. September 11th, terrorist attacks, we're all fearing things. As a result, we'll walk through the airport butt naked if that guarantees us that the metal death tube isn't going to come crashing to the ground. No idea why that's the same slide. Moving on from it. Who sets the agenda? 3 ways to look at who sets the agenda in the United States. The first and the most popular is the pluralistic viewpoint. The pluralistic viewpoint basically says that there are different groups in power in the United States at different times. And these different groups all have different says in what's going on. And they have different opportunities and different times where they have their decisions being heard. So there's separate arenas, and the interests in individuals who have power in one arena don't necessarily have power in the other. In this type of environment where everybody has a voice at different times, elections become the means of determining policies. Government plays the role of the umpire. The elitist idea towards the agenda is that the same interests are going to constantly win. And it basically says in the United States, business, upper and middle classes, and whites are going to dominate the policy agenda due to resources they have available to them. More importantly than what they're able to do, these groups are able to keep certain issues off of the agenda, and they're able to assure that there are non-decisions reached. And these non-decisions basically mean that there's a suppression or a thwarting of some challenge to the values of the elitist. So it's not just necessarily one issue as much as a power play that says, we're going to win on everything. You need to listen to us. And then lastly, there's the state-centric approach, which basically says that the political system itself is responsible for its own agenda. It's not about pressure groups, but pressured groups. The government's controlling public opinion. The government's controlling media. And as a result, they set the agenda for citizens to go off of. So if Barack Obama goes up and sees the presidency as a bully pulpit and gives this prolonged speech on some particular issue, the American people are likely to respond. And when they respond, Obama has basically determined what he's being judged off of. And this is really a situation where it's an in-between. What we tend to see happen agenda-wise with the state-centric process is more conservative than what we'd see from a pluralist perspective, but less conservative than what we see from the elitist model. Let me go back. I realized what happened here. This is supposed to be a slide that looks at the different kinds of agendas. There's 2 types of agendas in American politics, a systemic and an institutional agenda. Systemic agendas consist of all the issues that are commonly perceived by members of the political community as meriting some attention. So it is big and broad. It is every issue that people may care about. So if one individual cares about it, it should be on what we call the systemic agenda. On the other hand, we have what we call the institutional agenda, which is the set of items that are explicitly up for active and serious consideration by decision makers. So these are the issues that Congress is really potentially going to look at, or a state government is going to look at, or a city council is going to look at. And what we need to be afraid of on this institutional agenda is we get lots of what we call pseudo-issues, where I know that I have a big donor that cares about this particular policy. So as a result of their caring about it, I assure that we listen to it in Congress, even though in reality nothing's going to be done. It's just there for show. We're paying lip service to it. We're just trying to make sure our folks are realizing what we're doing. And we know there's different types of problems in government. We have new problems. We have cyclical issues that show up time and time and time again. We have recurrent issues. Recurrent issues being where policy keeps failing and they keep coming back, and we need to talk about them. So again, that's just that slide that we'd accidentally skipped. I'm glad I realized what it was. Getting on the agenda. Let's talk about how you actually get on the agenda in a political issue. Number 1, who it affects and to what extent. Whatever the policy you want to see government look at or the issue you want government to look at deals with, it really matters who's being affected and how badly they're being affected. Concentration and range play the key role here. If it is some type of deadly disease spreading that is only going to potentially reach 3 people in the United States, it's not going to make the national agenda. Now, if it's a disease that has killed 100,000 Americans, it's going to make the agenda. Or if it's something that is spread nationwide, it's going to make the agenda. The intensity matters. How do people react? How do people care? Do they feel that this is something that's important? If there's a lot of individuals in a pluralist perspective saying they care about an issue, it's going to show up on the agenda. And then there's also the element of visibility. Visibility can impact where something shows up on the agenda. We have in the United States especially what we refer to as the mountain climber syndrome. And the mountain climber syndrome says that if something makes the news and it shows up and it appears to be headed towards the agenda, Americans will be willing to spend money and do things for individuals that make no sense whatsoever. We will spend millions of dollars saving one individual who makes a stupid decision climbing a mountain, but we won't be willing to spend that same amount of money on some type of fix to save 300 or 400 people that are less well known, less noticed. To the same time, you could say that we'll go out and spend months searching for missing children, but we won't necessarily devote the resources necessary to make it so that children don't go missing. Ways to get on the agenda. If you have a presence of an analogy to other programs, so if it's similar, if it's something that's like something that's already existing, that will help. If you look at something like the Interstate Highway Program, Interstate Highway Program had really a twofold solution. Number one, it was going to improve transportation, and second, it was going to serve a domestic defense role. And when you have both of these and there's the spillover, all of a sudden it's easier for people to get on board. Any type of policy or issue that relates to symbols, if you get into American symbols, freedom, justice, equality, all of these types of values, people care about. You want to have things that resonate with the general population, especially if you view us as a pluralist society. And you look at things like welfare reform. When we go from aid for families with dependent children to temporary aid for needy families. The word family stays because that matters. People care about that. If you go and look at Clinton and some of his other symbols, you look at the social programs he brought about with welfare reform. The idea of midnight basketball. We're going to go into urban centers where we know that there are congregations of teenagers that are hanging out late at night, and we're going to give them a sport that they care about. In the same way, if you look at symbol manipulation, the idea of labeling something as the death tax automatically limits its potential to be successful because Americans hear that and don't like the connotation. And that's why government officials spend so much time on names. The choice of acronyms, the choice of the program name, the choice of how something is framed is going to impact it. It's why Republicans call the Affordable Care Act Obamacare. Democrats want it to be called the Affordable Care Act because it implies that people will be able to get affordable health care. Republicans want it called Obamacare, so instead of viewing it as a program or a policy, your attitudes towards the issue are nothing more than your attitudes towards Obama. Typically, to get on the agenda, you want something where there's an absence of private means. You're typically looking at public goods, things that once you're consumed, a large number of individuals can consume that without being controlled. They're not excludable. Defense, clean air, parks. You're looking at things that produce positive externalities, hopefully, which again, the idea of building a dam. A dam's being built, you get hydroelectric power from it, but you also get, a recreational area. You get flood control, you get economic developments. So externalities don't have to be negative. And we also want there to be some availability of technology. The idea being that we need there to be some solution to this policy or program. There's no point in putting it on the agenda if all we're going to do is sit around and feel bad that we can't do anything to stop it. The idea the book uses is that we don't want to be the kid running around with a hammer simply seeking things that need to be nailed in because he has a hammer. Policy formulation. So say we get something onto the agenda. This issue arises, we care about it, we make a big deal about it. What do? We see lots of things that happen here. We have analyses. We have economics playing a role. We have decision theories figuring out what we do. And there are groups of people in our country who actually go through and formulate the public policies we end up seeing. First off, obviously, is the public bureaucracy. This is you guys, where we see routines and procedures. Bureaucracy is known, obviously, for SOPs. We also, unfortunately, see self-protection. So when you're being asked to formulate policy, you're going to do it in a way that makes sure that your agency doesn't get hit or your job doesn't get hit. We like bureaucracies because we know they'll do something. If a higher level of government comes down and says, you need to make something happen related to X, bureaucracy will do that. But the one thing to remember is that it can be narrowing rather than broadening to utilize public bureaucracies. And this is unfortunately because it's professional expertise. If you're within an agency or a policy area, you probably know a lot about that. You probably have your own set views. And as a result, you're going to be less willing to actually look broader. We also have think tanks and shadow cabinets. Which again, think tanks, we're looking at things like Brookings, the American Enterprise Institute, RAND, the Heritage Foundation, public policy think tanks, places where highly trained academics come together and, to some ideological bent typically, try to figure out what they would suggest to decision makers what we do. And universities do this just as much. We have interest groups. Obviously, interest groups have clear interest. There are public interest groups like Common Cause and the Center for the Public Interest, which try to say they don't have a political bent. But in reality, they do as much as anybody else. And then last, we have members of Congress. They formulate policy. They're the ones who actually write the laws, vote on the laws, debate the laws. And in that position, they have lots of pull and lots of potential. How do we formulate it? The fact of the matter is we need creativity. Little may be known about the problem area. When sexting first became kind of hotbed national issue, folks in Congress didn't know what to do with it. It was new. It was different. We didn't know what laws applied. We didn't know what policies we already had on the books that could potentially touch on the issue or hit on the issue. So even if government doesn't know much about a particular issue, they still may need to do something, especially if it's a pluralistic society and members of society are telling them, hey, we want you to make something happen out of this. The concern, of course, on barriers, one, we may lack basic facts about the policy questions at hand. We may just not know. And then second, and perhaps even more intimidating, we may lack the information we need about the underlying processes that created the problem in the first place. So what's happening to lead to this issue that we're now trying to find a cause for, or a solution for, to have happened in the first place? So as a result, we end up in the book, and if you look at page 88, it gives you the nice 2x2 matrices. It is kind of breakdown on different types of policy formulation, looking at information and causation. If you look at the first block in the top left, we have what we call kind of routine formulations. High knowledge on information, high idea of what causes something. We know how to fix the problem. The book example for this is Social Security. Since we have adequate information and an accepted theory of causation, it's easy. We figure out what's causing it, we do something to stop the cause. If you go catty corner to that and look at the low knowledge, low information, we have what we call creative solutions. Creative solutions, creative policy formulation, this is something where we really don't necessarily know what we're doing. It's research and development, National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense. We don't have a lot of information, we don't know what the cause is, but we want to get closer. So what we do is we divert resources and say, start throwing shit at the wall and figure out what eventually sticks. And once it sticks, we start to gain information, and it becomes either conditional or hopefully routine at some point. When we have high information and low knowledge of causation, we have what we call conditional policy formulation. These are things like the economy. We have all sorts of information about things that impact the economy. We know things like interest rates. We know about monetary supply. We know inflation. We know unemployment. We know bond rates. We don't necessarily always know what fluctuations and which variables are causing greater economic changes. And because of that, it's always kind of this conditional policy formulation, where we're basically saying, if it's X, then we will do Y. Or if it's A, we will do B. We create these conditions ourselves. And then lastly, when you have low information but high knowledge of causation, we have what we call craftsman policies. This is where defense policies really fit in the best. We know exactly how to respond to threats. We know how to go to war. But at the same time, we get stuck doing it quite often with low information. We don't know exactly what's going on. We may have general, vague understandings, but we don't have a ton of information, even though we do know exactly what's causing these issues to occur. Aids for policy choices. This chapter wraps up talking about two major aids. The first being cost-benefit analysis, which is pretty straightforward, where we bring in the role of economics, and basically any project where total benefits exceed total costs, we do. Anything where it doesn't, we don't bother doing. You really want to end up going with whatever policy or project presents the greatest net total benefit to society. And then hopefully everything else will fit in under the budget. And then if we look at decision trees in a decision analysis, these are things we use when we have less certainty. And the book example is a great one if you look at figure 4.2, where you imagine being a mayor of a town and trying to figure out, do I evacuate or do I not evacuate? And if you look at the options presented, if you evacuate, there's a 30% chance the hurricane hits. And if you've done that, you will lose nothing. So you're not going to lose anything if you evacuate and the hurricane hits. If you evacuate and the hurricane misses, it's going to be a loss of approximately $10 million, which ultimately is an expected loss of $7 million because it's 10 million times the 0.7 for the probability. However, if you don't evacuate and the hurricane hits, 30% chance it hits, you're going to lose $100 million, which means your expected loss is $30 million, 100 million times 0.3, whereas if you don't evacuate and the hurricane misses, you're not going to lose anything. So ultimately in this decision analysis, if you're the mayor, you look at it and see, my strongest fear would be I don't evacuate and the hurricane hits and I'm down $30 million, so we choose to evacuate because if we evacuate and it ends up missing, we're going to lose $7 million. We're going to lose $10 million in that case, but there's only a chance of losing $7 million based on the probabilities. So if you start working out these situations, you can start to make better, more informed decisions. Now, granted, the issue is how in the hell do you come up with those probabilities? And that's always going to rely on, human judgment. That's a subjective number that's going in there. You're never going to know for sure what those probabilities are. You listen to your experts and hope that they're not leading you astray in what they're telling you. Policy design, the fact of the matter is the United States is always going to resist any type of comprehensive approach to policy design, which is a shame. There's a difference between a planned or rationalistic approach to creating policies and state-sponsored socialism, totalitarianism, whatever other buzzwords individuals who are more opposed to government make. And that's a key thing to point out here. It's not necessarily even the libertarian argument that comprehensive approaches to design are bad because government's involved. It's much more of a conspiracy theory, comprehensive rational decisions basically mean government is out to get me. We just prefer incremental policy changes. We like slow change. We're a conservative country like that. And more importantly, we don't always agree on the nature of problems. There are things where some people say it is the end of the world that X is happening, and other people say, I don't care about X. And if we can't even agree on the nature of the problems, how in the world can we as a country agree on what the solutions to those problems are? It puts us in a situation where we're unable to really get past ourselves.